goes a little something like.
Hello Literates, I'm Britt Ryderly and welcome back to Writer's Ambition. For those of you who've been hanging in since episode 1, use a real one. And for those of you who are just finding my humble channel, welcome, we hope you stay a while. Okay, new year, new series. So I am starting a series called Within the Discourse, and it is essentially me talking about things that I'm hearing and putting them into a discourse. Woo, whoa, wow. Shocking plot twist. And I'm starting this series for a couple of reasons. One, in this new year, I'm going to do what I want on my channel. I'm going to make the videos that I want. I hope y'all like them, but I'm not going to only make the videos that I think will get clicks and views, like wrap-ups or TBRs. I've never made TBRs, I've never done wrap-ups. Might I do a wrap-up in this year? Yeah, I might. But I'm also going to talk about not just romances and fantasy, which I love, but also other books that I have to be reading all the time, like Black critical theory, like Black women's intellectual history, like Black women's literary fiction. Like, I am responsible to that, to those discourses and to those genres as well professionally. And those are books as well. So even though those are not the most popular books on BookTube, I'm still going to talk about them, particularly when it comes to me hearing things that are pulling from these discourses but not citing these discourses. And y'all know how I feel about citationality, particularly when we're citing or not citing Black women. And so that's what this series is going to be. It's going to be me talking about a particular thing that I've been hearing around, whether in these BookTube streets, in these book Twitter streets, or just in these streets where I'm walking, and saying, hey, that actually has its roots in X book or so-and-so professor or whatever. That's what it's going to be. So I hope that you like it. If nothing else, you'll learn something that perhaps you didn't know, or you'll hear something affirm that you did. But that's what this series is going to be. In the first installment of that series, I want to talk about respectability. So I hear respectability used all the time like a curse word, and it typically comes out of like, oh, so-and-so is just trying to be respectable. Oh, so-and-so is just on them respectability politics. And the just is what gets me, because there's nothing just about respectability politics, but we'll get to that later. And so I want to bring us in to a discourse of where that term came from, how it's moved through, so that we can be more responsible and respectful when we're using these terms, particularly when we're trying to critique people for being respectable. I need to stay on script, because I could go off for a literal hour about it, but I won't, because even if these videos are less and more these days, it would literally be a snap fest. So I still need to like keep it somewhat contained. So I have a partial script. We'll see how this goes. All right. So we need to talk about respectability. The term politics of respectability was coined by Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham in her 1993 text, Righteous Discontent, the Women's Movement in the Black Baptist Church, 1880 to 1920. That period, 1880 to 1920, is referred to both as the Progressive Era and the Women's Era. It depends on who you're talking to or who you're reading as to what they'll refer to it as. I believe Professor Higginbotham refers to it as the Women's Movement in her text. Dr. Higginbotham is a professor of history and African American studies at Harvard University. She's also the president of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, or ASALH, which was founded in 1915. All right. we're not going to go through our entire book. I want us to be in a discourse. I want to sort of weave between several texts that point to tenets of respectability, and then end with sort of what that means for how we talk about it today. And that will keep me from just starting to go into like conference mode where I am essentially reading y'all an essay. Not that I would care if I really had planned to do that, because, you know, my channel. But that's not what I want this to be. So to keep myself moving, I'm not going to stay in this particular text for the entire however many minutes, okay? But I will just start with her because she's the one that coined it. And I also just want to say that again and again, because no one is citing her when we're talking about respectability. People just like throw the word out there and don't talk about, like, she didn't invent the word respectability, but in so much as we're talking about respectability as a politic, she is the one that forged that intervention. And she was talking particularly about Black women. And I do hear mostly Black people talking about it as a critique, but like, knowing your history ain't just about Black History Month. All right. So her argument, and I'll just read it because she can say it more succinctly than I. Her argument for the book, which is not about politics of respectability, that's literally the last chapter of the book. Her argument for the entire book is that women were crucial to broadening the public arm of the church, which was a huge foundational social institution in the Black community. That women were crucial to broadening the public arm of the church and making it the most powerful institution of racial self-help in the African American community. During these years, the church served as the most effective vehicle by which women and men alike, pushed down by racism and poverty, regrouped and rallied against emotional and physical defeat. This is literally page 1 of the book. That is her argument, right? That women were crucial to effectively broadening the social arm of the church. I could get into the history of the church in the Black community. I'm not going to. Suffice to say, it was hugely important. A lot of programs that the Black community received were funneled through the church. Schools, libraries, voter education, registrations, like all of those things through the church. Food pantries through the church. Clothes drives through the church. All of these things were funneled through the church. So social welfare, yes, indeed. And she's saying, in addition, the political activism of the church, Black women were crucial in broadening that arm of the church effectively. And by effectively, I shall say, like in the early chapters, being responsible not just to generalizing race as male, but effective also in the way of being responsible for men's interests, but women's interests as well, and pushing them and prying them, women, out of the private sphere and into the public sphere, which is also where politics are happening, right? Okay, so that's what she's starting off with. She ends with the politics of respectability. And a lot of the critiques that I hear about politics of respectability are essentially that it's like assimilationist and that it's Black people being on their best behavior for white people, and more of the same. Hugely reductive, hugely reductive of what politics of respectability was, particularly because I don't see politics of respectability named for what it was, and that's a strategy, which then shows that it wasn't just like, oh, this is like conditioning holdovers from slavery. No, it was a strategy in reaction to how Black people were being treated at that time in the country, how Black women were being treated at that time. And we'll get into a super gendered look at politics of respectability in a second. But just to start with Professor Higginbotham, she herself has said that there are critiques to be levied against politics of respectability. She says that in the book. She's never not said that, but framing it appropriately and in its context, she also makes a certain caveat that I think is worth reading. Why? Because we are in the discourse. So here is how she introduces politics of respectability. The politics of respectability emphasized reform of individual behavior and attitudes, both as a goal in itself and as a strategy for reform of the entire structural system of American race relations. With regard to the Black Baptist women's movement, such a politics did not reduce to an accommodationist stance toward racism, or a compensatory ideology in the face of powerlessness, nor did it reduce to a mindless mimicry of white behavior or a front without substance or content. Instead, the politics of respectability assumed a fluid and shifting position along a continuum of African American resistance. Through the discourse of respectability, the Baptist women emphasized manners and morals while simultaneously asserting traditional forms of protest such as petitions, boycotts, and verbal appeals to justice. A few things I want to pull out of what she has said. Not accommodationist, not mimicry of white behavior. It is not Black people acting white. I hear that a lot now. It is not Black people acting white. And I hear that from Black people. Not Black people acting white. That is not what it is. It's a strategy. It's meant to be fluid. It's in a continuum, which also means, mind you, that politics of respectability, she coined the term to talk about these women in 1880 to 1920, but it didn't just occur here. And it wasn't meant to stay here. It's meant to be improvised for your need of the time. Why? Because it's a strategy. Okay. So this is how Higginbotham introduces respectability. I want to talk about a particular, and I'm going to put her aside. I just wanted to start with her because she coined the term. But to her point of it being a continuum, she's not the only one that's talking about the phenomenon that was politics of respectability. And you should definitely, if nothing else, read that chapter because she goes very, very in depth into how politics of respectability showed up. She talks about it espousing Victorian or middle class ideas, but working class Black people were espousing it as well. Working class Black people are not a monolith no more than Black people in general are a monolith. So there were acceptances and rejections of it to be had on every class level. So for people who were like, oh, it's just for middle class Black people, that was never the case. And it did emphasize depending on yourself, working, having a work ethic. There were schools that were planned, or there was one school in particular that was planned around politics of respectability, and the values of it, of hard work and self-respect, these sorts of things. So it's not about behavioral mimicry or anything of the sort. Okay, now let's talk about stakes, because I use the word strategy, and where there is strategy, there is stakes. We know this as readers and writers. Like, if a book don't have stakes, it's nothing. But this is not a book. This is Black life and Black resistance. So she talks about strategy. Another historian, Darlene Clark Hines, talks about stakes, and she has this essay that she wrote a couple years earlier in 1989, and it's called Rape and the Inner Lives of Black Women in the Middle West. And Professor Hines is also a historian. I don't know if I said that. So her essay talks about, essentially, she coins her own term. It's not politics of respectability, but these two are related, and that's why I'm bringing it up, because they are existing in the same continuum. Professor Clark Hines coins a term called, culture of dissemblance. That term, she says, was institutionalized as strong as it ever was in 1896 at the inaugural conference of the National Association for Colored Women, the NACW. What it was essentially was appearing to be showing your full self to the public while in fact hiding your private life, dissembling. right? That's what it was. The stake, because I don't want to, it's a 10-page essay, you should definitely read it, but to be brief, because I could be long, the stakes are Black women's sexual and economic autonomy, right? Black women's sexual and economic autonomy. Black women were being sexually assaulted, and the justification was their non-normative or public sexuality. So the strategy was to hide it. Now, people can say today what they want to, but when we're talking about protecting bodies, getting jobs, this is the strategy. The other thing that I'll say real quick, and Candace Jenkins talks about this in Private Lives, Proper Relations, and this is not a history, this is a literary analysis more. She quotes Toy Derricott's memoir, and the memoir is called The Black Notebooks. And Toy says this very important thing that again goes to stakes. And this is what they say. I am sure that years of conditioning in a society that blamed us for our own destruction, they're animals, they don't deserve any better, being aware of what power white people's thoughts had over our lives made us feel especially vulnerable. This goes to psychic space of dissemblance that Darlene Clark Hines talks about. This also goes to this goes mostly to the culture of dissemblance, but those two, I think of them always as sort of like sister strategies, dissemblance and respectability, and both of those are concerned with controlling the narrative, right? Controlling the narrative of how Blackness functions in America. It is concerned with taking hold of identity. This is who we are. We are hardworking. We are moral, right? We invest in our communities. We invest in education. We invest in health. We invest in economics and Black economics, right? This is, and Higginbotham goes more into that in the chapter Politics and Respectability. But I think that what Derricott is saying is worth pairing with Professor Hines, and that the stakes have always been bodies for Black people. Of course, we're concerned with representation, and representation is always the justification for our death or our rape. I don't hear that being acknowledged in the current Twitter conversations around respectability, and I think that's a mistake, and a dangerous and negligent thing to forget. The stakes of these things that we're saying are antiquated, because have the stakes really changed that much? I don't know. I don't think so. The statistics of Black women in trafficking and sexual abuse and domestic violence are certainly not encouraging, right? So the stakes haven't changed dramatically. So you dissemble, or you abide by these politics of respectability where you put forth yourself as your best argument, right? You put forth yourself as your best argument. This is a way of framing it that Deborah Gray White, another historian, has in a book called Too Heavy a Load. And she talks about talking to Mary Church Terrell, icon. We're running out of time, so like look her up. Mary Church Terrell, icon, and the first president of the NACW. But these women didn't live their private lives publicly. They didn't talk about their family publicly. They didn't talk about their sexuality publicly. They talked about their political agenda, which was Black women having a voice in politics, Black women's protection, Black women in the economic sector, like being outside of the domestic sphere, essentially, because they had their own bodies on the line. It's not just about, oh, like pull your pants up, which is what it's become, talking about clothes. Oh, pull your pants up, or oh, your name sounds ghetto, or oh, like these sorts of things where it's like, do you think that sagging pants is why an entire generations of Black people were so concerned about the way that they were presenting themselves in the world? No, it's because they were being raped and killed, and the justification was that they were criminal, that they were criminal, that the women were loose, and so they secreted away their private lives. Who were any of us to condemn them as when they're trying to protect their bodies, when that's the strategy? And again, like, in the time that we have, there's no way that I could really plumb the depths of these arguments, because it's also not just about sexual protection, although that cannot be overstated. There's also the economic, and then all of that under the umbrella of Black women's autonomy, which Black women were consistently, and Professor Hines says this, consistently wrestling with sovereignty over their own bodies and their own destinies. That is why they create the culture of dissemblance, to not have to be accountable to what they're doing in their inner lives. It creates psychic space between the public, who is trying to over-determine Black women's lives through their representation. I'll say that again. The public trying to over-determine Black women's lives based on their representation. So the answer of culture of dissemblance, of politics of respectability, is to control the representation, to protect yourself. It creates psychic space between you and an antagonistic white society. That is the purpose of this strategy, this improvisational, right? It changes over time, depending on how you need it. That is the purpose of this strategy of dissemblance and respectability politics. It's for protection, and it was necessary. Now, in the ways that it gets used now, I understand that people are like, oh, well, that's antiquated. Right, but you need to pay your dues to the fact that that protected your ancestors. You also need to understand that, like, it evolves over time. So do we need it to function in the exact same ways it did in the women's era? No, but there's no need to throw it completely away, rather than engaging it for what it was and saying, okay, how can we shift this to our purposes? What are some tenets of this? What are some parts of this that we can use now? And I think that's a conversation that is far richer, far more respectful, and far more generative than just trying to throw out the baby with the bathwater of saying respectability politics have no place in 2021. Because if dissemblance does, then respectability does, because those two are functioning in concert. Or, as Professor Higginbotham says, within a continuum. And if we're going to talk about it responsibly, we have to honor and acknowledge that continuum, because we're a part of it. Okay. So this was the first installment of my Within the Discourse series. I hope that you liked it, but if you didn't, I did. I enjoy getting that off my chest. Let me know in the comments. If you have any questions about respectability politics, if you have any questions about anything that I just said, how you see respectability working in 2021, thoughts, welcome. Okay.